When I started, I went to an economic development organization. I asked for a $50,000 loan. They gave me a $25,000 loan. They took a mortgage on my house and on my mother's house, and the closing costs were like $6,000 of that $25,000.
Whoa.
What I did find is that there were other business owners. Actually, in that time where I was applying for the $50,000 loan, there was another person, a man, who had applied for a $50,000 loan, and they gave it to him. And it was very much like a handshake kind of deal, is what it seemed like to me at the time. And I definitely felt that. Like, I felt the impact of that.
Yeah. That's not an uncommon story at all.
Welcome to Seriously Catherine, a self-confidence podcast for women who want to be taken seriously in the world of business. Here's your guest host.
Welcome to today's episode of Seriously Catherine. I am your guest host, Noa Simons, founder and CEO of GoodBread, and also the president and CEO of the Upstate Capital Association of New York. I will be joined today by my good friend, Heidi and Noa, who is an expert in all things small business and access to capital. She and I are going to talk about different aspects of capital and hopefully demystify some of the dynamics for you small business owners who are listening. But first, here's my hot take. All right, my hot take for today is that upstate New York is actually a great place to start and grow a business. And I would say some people might disagree with that subject. I think New York has gotten a bad rap for being a place for small business, but there are a lot of people working on changing a bunch of those different dimensions. And one of the greatest examples of this is 43 North in Buffalo, the startup ecosystem in general. There's tons of capital that's available in both debt and equity for small businesses and high growth potential companies. I'll be in Buffalo in a couple of weeks to celebrate on the private equity side the community that is there and that is surrounding growth and change leveraging equity. And so you can check out the Buffalo Private Equity Summit if you're interested. I'll be there in person. And if you have a disagreement on this hot take, I'd love to hear from you about challenges that you face in growing a business in this region. I think the more we can talk together about those things, the more we can help drive change. So would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, Heidi. I know for business owners, particularly women, but I think business owners universally, access to capital is, it's a huge question. It mystifies a lot of people. And so I'm excited to have the opportunity to work on demystifying access to capital together with you because I know you're super knowledgeable about this topic.
Yeah, I have to say you are one of my favorite people to work with in this space. And you're absolutely right. Like it confuses people, access to capital. I think you and I see a lot of times, or I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. You see people looking for capital in the wrong places, like small business owners looking for venture capital, or people who need venture capital looking for debt. And I think finding the right fit for people is oftentimes like the hardest part for them.
That's 100% right. And I think there are a couple of reasons for it. I think that for one thing, there isn't a good source to go to say, here are all the options for capital. And if you are this, then you fit that. And actually, one of the businesses that I've designed, at least sketched out on paper, but haven't actually decided to build, is a tool exactly for this, where people can go and say, they could just talk to the screen, or they could type things in, or upload a business plan if they have it, but some sort of flexible interface for people to say, here's who I am and what I'm doing, and have that spit back. Here are the types of capital you could access. Here's some things and give them maybe percentage likelihood for getting them in some formula that we derived. And then, I think the step from that is making introductions and connections to actually where that capital could literally come from. So, figuring out the mechanics of that business is something I've thought about off and on a lot through my work with Upstate Capital, and less so in the work I'm doing now with GoodBread, because I'm pretty focused on making small business loans to Main Street business owners. But I would love to hear about your experience as a business owner, as, just what have your personal experiences been like around access to capital?
Yeah, great question. So you mentioned credit cards. So I started Plum Oyster Bar in 2016. It was an oyster bar in Troy, New York. And when I started, I went to an economic development organization. I asked for a $50,000 loan. They gave me a $25,000 loan. They took a mortgage on my house and on my mother's house, and the closing costs were like $6,000 of that $25,000.
Whoa.
Yeah. I make fun of the person who was running that organization all the time because I took over that organization at a later date. And so I kind of tease, like, I think they kind of saw me as like, what is this PhD student or person doing this oyster bar? Like,
right.
What is she doing? Like, she's never going to make this work, you know? And made it work.
Did you pay back the loan?
I sure did. But I did use credit cards too. So I just took out a 0% interest credit card, had like a $25,000 lending limit, and I used that as like a line of credit. I went to a kitchen supply store. They were fantastic, so I am going to say their name, B&G Restaurant Equipment. They gave me a 6-month 0% interest loan for all of the kitchen equipment.
Wow.
And I went back to them every other time I needed equipment and sent everyone to them because they were fantastic. And then I was lucky enough to have kind of friends and family that I took some money in the form of a loan from friends and family to start the business. But I mean, when we started, it was like pretty much like plywood tabletops. Like, we had what we needed in order to get the business started, but we definitely bootstrapped it for sure. So every dollar that we took in, we used to buy things that could then make more money. And by year 2, I got pretty good at, ensuring that we had the right amount of cash flow to say, like, okay, we're going to buy this kegerator, and that kegerator is going to, have this much impact on our cash flow, and then we'll be able to kind of pay back these 0% interest credit cards in time. But it was all very much cobbled together, for sure. And I think the thing that you're saying that I find so compelling is that what I did find is that there were other business owners. Actually, in that time where I was applying for the $50,000 loan, there was another person, a man, who had applied for a $50,000 loan, and they gave it to him. And it was very much like a handshake kind of deal, is what it seemed like to me at the time. And I definitely felt that. Like, I felt the impact of that. I'm not sure what behaviors someone would have been able to see. I guess they would have seen that I paid off my student loans. I guess they would have seen, a lot of other factors about me. But it definitely, it was very difficult to get the money to start and grow that business, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's not an uncommon story at all. Are there other situations where you have taken on outside capital for different things?
I had an idea for a business that is actually how we met, Receipt HQ.
Right.
Yeah,
That's right.
So it's a software company. And when I was going through that process and pitching that, some people had offered to invest in that company. But I actually didn't think it would grow big enough to provide a return on the investment. So I actually gained a lot of credibility by saying no to people who said, oh, I think I would like to invest in that business. I said no because ultimately it would not have produced, it just wouldn't have produced a return in a way that I would have been comfortable with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as a pre-seed entrepreneur with a software business, I can understand the fear there.
Yeah.
So I totally appreciate that. And I understand why that buys you more credibility with people who know you.
Yeah. And then in terms of like just watching people who were starting their own business or who were growing their business, I think I saw very much what you saw at the SBDC, right? A lot of times we require these business plans, for instance, to take out capital. There's actually, and David Brown, the chair of Upstate Capital, actually shares this fact a lot, which I like, so I'm stealing, which there's this Babson study that shows that there's an inverse correlation between somebody doing a business plan and the successful growth of their business. And that's because business plans kind of narrow you into Like you're only going to hit whatever you wrote in your business plan, right? So one of the best things I think we can do to kind of change a little bit of the lending landscape is something that I teach my students, which is, you should do marketing plans. You should do customer discovery reports. You should do all of these things that are open-ended, that are truly, they can show you how big the business is going to be, can get cash flow projections, that kind of thing, but they're more open-ended than a business plan with set growth projections, which are really limitations.
That's an interesting perspective, because one of the things that I like to talk about is what fundamental assumptions are you making about your business, and how does that translate into an economic model that makes sense for you to make a case to either a bank or a private capital investor, depending on the type of business that you're building.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think is just getting creative with capital sources. I mean, I tell that story about how I was cobbling together money to start Plum Oyster Bar, but most businesses are trying to figure out exactly how to cobble things together at first, which then ultimately will probably either get refinanced if it's debt, or we'll get, there'll be another round if it's equity, and things will get a little sorted out. But I think being aware of the foundations that you're setting, knowing that you're going to have to probably cobble things together a bit at first, but making sure that foundation is really solid, right? That you're not messing anything up on your cap table if you're raising equity, or that you're not, doing something with your legal documents that you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
Having that foresight.
What would you say to an entrepreneur who, or a small business owner who has been in business for a while and can see some growth opportunities in their business, but is really scared about the idea of engaging outside capital?
Yeah, I think taking it like step by step, right? So one of the things that I like about GoodBread and this concept is that if I'm lending to somebody with an SBA 7A loan, I want them to borrow probably more than they think that they need, because they can't really come back to the well for a long time. And that, I think, can really make people very scared when they are thinking about borrowing money. So if you can have people be able to take things in bite-sized chunks, like I know when I had the restaurant, if you said, hey, we'll lend you the money to buy this kegerator, and I know in my mind the opportunity that presents and how long I think it would take to pay that off, then you get braver each time that you do that. So I think my advice would be is if there are opportunities to take small bite-sized chunks of lending, or small bite-sized chunks of investment, that's probably the best thing. Just making sure it's not too expensive to do that legally, I think would be the biggest hang up.
I think that's interesting, because one of the things from the lender's perspective that I think about is that I am trying to build a relationship and I want to build trust. And maybe a good way to do that is actually just start doing the thing that we want to do, which is having a lending relationship. And so what if every new customer coming to GoodBread starts with a $5,000 loan that gets prepaid in, a couple months or 3 or 4 months, whatever time period. But I'm playing with that as a go-to-market strategy, a piece of the go-to-market strategy.
Yeah, I like it a lot, because then you show that they have the capacity to pay it back.
Well, it's character and capacity, and it's like building them. It's building muscles, right? Like you're building the muscle of I take some money and I pay it back and I figure out how to use it and see what kind of flexibility that gives me. But then that unlocks, more potential growth and some interaction that is net positive to the planning and the orientation, the strategy that has to go into building the business.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great idea, right? And maybe even if it's not a set amount of like $5,000, but if it's a set thing, right? So a lot of Main Street businesses, they have things that they need to buy, right? And so even if I don't get the impression that you're going to do like a UCC filing on the collateral or anything, but in this scenario, right, you in theory could, right? Like, so you could say, or there's so many different ways you could go with GoodBread. You could start to work with the type of equipment people that I worked with.
The restaurant people, right.
So like to help people get the resources that they need. Because the other piece of advice I would give entrepreneurs is that it is, this is a frustrating thing for people to hear. It was frustrating for me to hear. But most of the time, you don't actually need money. Most of the time, you don't need money. You need a resource. So money is oftentimes what gets you that resource, but it's a resource that you need. And so unfortunately, I think people get over-mentored, underfunded, so they get a little exhausted by that advice. But ultimately, like if someone was providing me with a kegerator, not with the $5,000 it would take to buy the kegerator, I still am in a better position, right? Because I have the resource that I need. So I think sometimes people just think of like money as
like a proxy or something.
Yeah. Or they actually, it's that they don't think of it like a proxy. They think of it like income.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So they don't think of it like a proxy. They think of it like income.
Right. Well, and if they could think of it as a proxy and then take the proxy out and just get the thing that they need. Yeah.
Totally.
Absolutely.
And I think that a lot of economic development resources, a lot of not-for-profit resources try to provide what entrepreneurs need, sometimes more successfully than others. But ultimately, I think finding some type of resource that can really get you where you need to be is much better than finding money that you then have to spend on a resource.
Interesting. That's interesting. That might be a hot take too.
I know. I got a lot of hot takes today.
I would expect nothing less.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about GoodBread, though, just a little bit and how GoodBread fits in? Because there is access to capital with GoodBread, my understanding of it.
No, we will be very shortly a small business lending company. We have raised nearly $1 million, and some of that will go towards our initial loans, which we hope to make in November. So we're definitely on the path. We've got an MVP coming out at the end of October. A big part of the reason for me to do this podcast is to find people who want to join me in this journey and be my beta users and my initial lendees and customer partners to help build a business that really fits what the community needs.
Yeah, and I think, so I know you're going to give a hot take later. So I have a hot take, which is that pitch competitions are actually somewhat disastrous for helping people get access to capital because it shoehorns all business owners into kind of this pitching mentality where they're pitching in almost like a venture setting because that's how they're taught to pitch. So I'd be curious to hear how entrepreneurs are going to pitch themselves in GoodBread. Like, what does that look like? And how is that different?
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. I wonder how many business owners have thought about pitch competitions because, we have these different segments of our audience and different kinds of people we have worked with. And so within GoodBread, we're talking about Main Street business owners who've been in business for a year or two or longer, who have probably 6 figures of revenue already, who are, they're looking to open a second location or they're looking to add some inventory for a big event they have coming up or various growth scenarios for Main Street businesses. And these aren't the kinds of people who have startup ideas where they're trying to get visibility and build, energy and enthusiasm around what they're doing and get access to capital for them. So I think our lens is slightly different, but I like your hot take on pitch competitions. I've had a lot of, as you know, I run one for entrepreneurs, and I've worked actually really hard in that competition to facilitate people becoming better at communicating the key important aspects of their business concept or their operating business efficiently. Mm-hmm. But it's not the same thing as being great at sales. And in fact, when we are coaching the judges to evaluate candidates and evaluate competitors, we are asking them to not factor in the sort of salesy, it's really hard not to, right? Because we all have our biases and all have the things that we lean towards. And, people who are exciting, salesy kinds of people are, exciting to watch and energizing. But I'll give you like an example from that competition. A woman, was one of the people who competed and won a couple of years ago had a horse blanket washing business. I remember. Yeah. And so, that competing on the same stage with some really compelling, PhD students from top tier universities. And so I think pitch competitions can be terrible and they can wedge people into trying to just highlight the sort of shiny parts and highlight the sales piece. But there's a lot that goes into building businesses. Within GoodBread, we're not looking at people that way. So we're looking, I would say it's more akin to a traditional lending model where we're factoring in character, behavior, and getting to know people within the context of their communities.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked a lot about like acquisition entrepreneurship and commercialization of academic technology and all of these different ways that someone can be an entrepreneur. And, I've been guilty with my own students of having them pitch all the time. But actually what I did this year is because New York State Business Plan Competition has that executive summary and actually the slides. And so that's how they're going to end the semester, is with putting their business into New York State Business Plan Competition. And I actually think that those pitch slides do a great job of saying, it doesn't have to be high growth. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be one specific type of business, like you're supporting entrepreneurship.
Right. So, I think pitch competitions can be a source of capital, especially the one that I run for super early stage concept businesses. But, people who get on the pitch circuit, I think that's not really the target audience that we're talking to for GoodBread. I think it's an important audience, and I think it's important to, pros and cons to the pitch sort of scenario. But I think it overall is a good thing for entrepreneurship and for community.
And I think the pitching, right? Like when I think about my time at the bank, people still had to come in with a pitch for us lending to them. There was still an element of a pitch, right? It was less contrived. Obviously, it was more of a conversation, a one-on-one. So how is GoodBread gonna do that at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're literally talking about that now with our development team of how do we recreate the loan officer interview in a virtual environment. And so that's top of mind, and I think going to be a key differentiator in our application process compared to other solutions that people might find. But I think you're just touched on a thing that I was hoping to spend some time on today, which is your experience as a lender. Mm-hmm. So I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about the kinds of businesses you were looking at, what factors you were thinking about when you were approving or declining loans. Talk a little bit about the process.
Yeah. So I have such an interesting, strange career that, you're super familiar with, but small business owner, restaurant owner, and then started getting involved in economic development through sitting on IDA board. And then that brought me to Pioneer, where I served as the venture and growth banking relationship manager. And I was really tasked when I came in to Pioneer with how do you lend money to entrepreneurs? And so I took that question very seriously. And the best way to lend to them is through government-backed programs. So 7As, 504s, and I think I don't want to get into the specifics of those, but there's Main Street lending. I ran the PPP program. So essentially anything that was able to get the deal done in a non-traditional way, I was ultimately responsible for at the bank. And that was not just federal programs. It was also local programs, like Albany has the Alltech Fund. There were a number of different things that we could tap into. One very upsetting statistic to me is that 80% of all revolving loan funds in the United States have never been lent out. And a reason for that is that a lot of times these revolving loan funds sit within local economic development agencies, and the people that sit on the boards to lend that money are often bankers. Because when do who do you go to sit on that board? Of course, you go to your local banker. But the problem with doing that is then bankers are putting a banking lens on all of these loans that are meant to be, not necessarily a lower bar, but a different type of lending. And so I guess my role there in the bank was really to do alternative-based lending. I mean, that's no better way to say that. And then to pair that with people who were also taking on investment, because that is something that I think can be confusing to lenders if somebody also has investors in their business.
Yeah. One of the things that when I was prepping for this conversation, I think there's a lot of level setting that we could do today on what are the different types of capital, what are the different types of capital providers, what are the profiles of investments or capital deployment when people are going to actually write checks, what are their expectations, and focusing on the sort of key demographic for GoodBread. You're a small business owner, been in business for a while, see some growth opportunity. Like, should you talk to an angel investor? Should you talk to a venture capitalist? How do you know what bank to pick? Should you go to all the banks? Like, how much time do you have to dedicate to this? Mm-hmm. And I'm curious if you have sort of a a perspective on all of these questions, or want to riff on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think, I mean, at base, I think the first question is, debt versus equity, right? So what I tell people all the time is if you are trading a portion of your company for money, that is the most expensive money you'll ever take. So you don't want to do that unless there is some compelling reason to do that, unless you have a very high growth company. And then finding the debt solutions, although that is individualized, I do think that there are some easy ways to start getting to plugged into potential debt providers. So the first is those economic development organizations. I mean, that is a very underutilized source of capital. What I tell students all the time is the government wants you to start and grow a business. This blows their mind. They're like, what are you talking about? And I was like, I promise you, the government wants you to start and grow a business and will help you do that. So it's not that government lending or government-backed lending is the only way to get debt for a entrepreneur, but a bank is not going to lend based on projections unless it's a 7(a) loan. And so startups, it is much easier to lend on projections with a 7(a) than it is to lend to a company who's in the red.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to back up just to the beginning there, debt versus equity, to clarify for people who are not sort of real familiar with all these terms. Equity is when you're actually selling pieces of your business to an investor. And people do that in scenarios where they're taking on angel investors or venture capital or other forms of private equity, right? And on the debt side, there's a full spectrum of debt. And for high risk, higher or perceived higher risk opportunities, the government steps in or has a lot of solutions that are potentially more cost effective, more feasible for small business owners compared to maybe taking private capital if they could get it.
Or I mean, so with a 7(a), it's still the bank's capital. It's just there's a guarantee from the government. So there's a backstop. So banks are more willing to lend because there is this backstop of a SBA guarantee on the loan. But the bank still is going to have to perfect all the, it's still a bank loan and requires all the work of a bank. Why I'm interested in GoodBread is it seems like things can happen a lot faster from what you've described. So it can be a faster source of capital. And I would just love to hear about, how you're kind of seeing that fit into this landscape. And even just taking just banking and just venture, right? And then how does GoodBread fit into those two? And I know those are like super broad categories,
Well, so we are going to be a small business lender. We are a small business lender. We are anticipating starting to make loans in the next couple of months. And so non-bank financial, lender, financial partner for small businesses compared to a bank. When I think about other companies like us, I think our biggest competitor is actually personal credit cards. And what I advise businesses before starting GoodBread is that you don't necessarily lean entirely on your personal credit for growing your business, because you may be artificially constraining the growth based on your own credit profile. But your business might be very creditworthy for credit that you're not accessing. And that, so optimizing for the business versus looking, and of course it's a mix, right? You have to look at the owner, you have to look at the business, you have to look at where they are and where they're headed. At least that's the way we're thinking about it at GoodBread. I think, we are talking about taking a little bit more risk on the growth side. And the way we're underwriting that risk is through analyzing character and observing behavior, and then running analyses with the thesis that we can look at character and behavior of the borrower to significantly reduce the default rates. So that's the hypothesis in a nutshell.
And how fast would someone be able to secure the capital from GoodBread?
Yeah, that's a great
because there's a speed component to it as well, right?
Right. How long does it take to get a 7(a)?
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
I mean, not so there's there's SBA Express loans. There's also preferred lenders, but
the shortest amount of time you ever saw an SBA loan.
Shortest amount of time I ever saw, 30 days.
Yeah, and the longest.
9 months.
Yeah. Okay. So with GoodBread, we're talking about at least in the beginning. I mean, of course, ultimately, I'd love to be able to do it like within a day or two. I will learn if that is possible. In this immediate, I think we'll be able to do pre-approvals pretty fast. And we will need to obviously verify the information that we're given. And there are a couple things that are going to be a little bit intensive, and there maybe need to be a cycle back, certainly initially, as we work to understand the customers that we're working with. But I expect that we will be able to deploy capital within, 5 days. We'll be able to fund loans within 5 days.
And I know this is a hard question, but, as you're thinking about this, I think when people hear that model, they think of these like predatory lenders, right? They think of, I actually can't think of any right now, but, and good thing, because I shouldn't say them on our
That's
podcast.
What I was thinking too. Yeah. They're in my mind.
Yeah, that's right. Not going to say them now. So for those that's what I think a lot of people think of, right? Is they think of this predatory lending, but GoodBread is not that.
Well, no, we will not be that. My whole ethos about this business is that we can build trust and we can have integrity and we can lend at fair rates. I think the concept of fair is a bit of a judgment. It's a bit of depends on your perspective. I would say we see rates as high as 90 to 400%, like in terms of cost of capital for some of this predatory lending. I think there are a lot of companies that would not be described necessarily as predatory, but do have incredibly high rates of, average APRs of 60% and north. And so one of the North Stars for us is to be under the rate of credit cards. But still, sometimes I say, it might be 20%, it might be 22%. People are a little bit shocked at that. And I find that surprising, because when I look at the math from my perspective, I have the default rate, best in class at scale, 8% for small business owners. So that means 8 cents of every dollar, somebody's not going to pay back. So that has to go into the cost of pricing these loans. We need margin to run the business, right? We're taking on investors. We're a pre-seed company, and we have to operate the business and pay back those investors. So I'm modeling somewhere in 5 to 7% for that, depending on a couple of different scenarios. And then obviously the cost of capital. So we have to have a loan fund that we can deploy, and somebody has to fund that loan fund. And so getting free money would be great, but that's unlikely to be able to scale. And everything that we're doing with GoodBread, we want to operate at scale with as little human interaction as possible, partly because it makes it faster and more efficient for business owners, partly because it reduces bias in making lending decisions. And so we want to make access to capital much more available to people who have been historically marginalized in the finance system.
And when you were at Upstate Capital, is that kind of where you first saw this problem of like Main Street not having the growth capital they need fast enough and, with the right underwriting?
I mean, I see it all over, but actually 2 experiences kind of led me to this. One is I started a business as a food waste recycling company called Community Compost in New Paltz, where I live. And I went to the bank to apply for an equipment loan. And it took 30 days to get a declination. And I got declined at a bank it's a local community bank where I have, all of my accounts and my mortgage and everything. And I found that just shocking. I mean, it was really shocking, and it was a huge waste of time. So I found that personally really frustrating. The most precious resource for all of us is time. And so if people are wasting going down these rabbit holes, that's just it's not fair. And I want to make the world more fair. The other experience that I had a bunch of years ago now was I spent about 1.5 years as a small business advisor with the SBDC. When I first came back to the Hudson Valley, it was a good way for me to get to know the local community. And I had a lot of people come looking for capital, and we'd help them prepare business plans for banks. And so I got a sort of inside look at what that experience is like for a lot of different business owners. I think this might be a reason that you and I are, just like we connect so easily and really like working together, because there aren't very many people like us who have been seated at all of the different places in the table that we're talking about.
Yeah.
The debt, the equity, the business owner, the advisor. And I think it's really unusual for people to have that depth of and experience. Like, people just don't see the capital stack that way, which is one of the reasons I think it's so hard for people to navigate.
I completely agree. And I think there's never going to be a substitute for relationship building, for accessing capital. But what there is, and what you're doing, is there's a way to level that playing field.
Yeah.
There's absolutely a way to level the playing field, and there's not enough private work being done to do that. I think there's a lot of work to be done that is being done on the public side, but on the private side, I don't see as much. So that's why I'm super excited about GoodBread.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the ways in which you and I have connected is around some of the public work, at least with the business plan competition, where a lot of, for me, the motivation to take that on when it was about to stop existing and to help grow it and build it and sustain it, is that it is building a more level playing field. Mm-hmm. I don't believe in a fully level playing field. I don't think that's possible, but I think, we still have to work towards it. It's our moral obligation in this world to build more level playing fields. And so that sort of has driven a lot of the work with the business plan competition and drives a lot of the work that I'm doing now with GoodBread.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you so much for joining me today here. It's been great to talk to you and to get some of your wisdom, and I feel like we could talk for hours. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Been great to talk to you too.
It was so great to have Heidi here today talking about access to capital. I hope you all got a lot out of this conversation. I know for me, I thought her insight on putting the capital stack together, especially in the early days of building your business, I think she used the word cobbling. I think that's a really accurate way to portray the experience of a lot of people. And so thinking strategically and thoughtfully about that, ideally probably with some thought partners, is a good takeaway that I hope you all remember from this. Today's Saratoga Lifestyle section is brought to you by Saratoga Living After Hours. Do you have any experience with Gossip Girl? It was my guilty pleasure a few years ago. I binge watched it, I think maybe on Netflix. The woman who wrote Gossip Girl is going to be here in Saratoga on October 6th. And I encourage you to go and have brunch and check it out. She'll sign books and be able to talk all about how she came up with this very complicated story of people growing up in New York. For more information, get the link in the show notes. In today's serious business lesson, brought to you by the Palette community, I wanted to talk for a minute about financial projections. I think both of these words can be scary, and I want to make them less scary for you. Business projections are so helpful for thinking about what could happen in the future. You're not saying they're definitely going to happen, and you're probably not precisely right, but projections are a tool to help understand what assumptions you're making and how to map those out and what resources you might need to achieve them. That can also be helpful for you in heading off some negative consequences of doing something or not doing something. And so the exercise of looking at your assumptions, modeling them, and modeling can also be a scary word, but Google Sheets are available to everybody. And you can just write down a couple of details of what do you think is going to happen? What are some numbers that could be attached to that? How many units of the thing that you sell could you sell next year? What conditions need to exist for that to be possible? And just asking yourself some of these questions can be really helpful to analyze opportunities that you might be thinking about. And so I would encourage you to not be scared of opening a Google Sheet and putting some numbers into it and attaching some years and some assumptions, and just play around with it for fun. I think, well, maybe I have a funny idea of fun, but I think it's an interesting way to think about the future and to set some goals and understand your business in a greater level of detail. If you want a simple template, check the link in the show notes. All right, thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. And if you want to connect with me, slide into my DMs on Instagram. My handle is Catherine Hover.